room, Felix Larkin. Felix has had a long and distinguished career in the Irish Civil Service, and since his retirement has returned full-time to his first love, which is history. He is Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, former chairman of the newspaper and periodical History Forum of Ireland, heavily involved with the Irish Legal History Society, and is the treasurer of the Irish Academy of Historical Sciences as well. Felix has published widely on the history of the press in Ireland. His essays in all 3 volumes of the Edinburgh History of the British and Irish Press, and his essay, The Asinine Law, Irish Legal Cartoons, will be published later this year in Confluences of Law and History, Irish Legal History Society Discourses, and other papers, edited by Niamh, Howlin, and by Felix himself. So it's a great pleasure to have Felix here today to talk about one of the subjects that he has really developed a huge amount of expertise in, cartoons and the Irish, 2 centuries of humour. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Felix.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for that introduction, and we thank you all for coming here this afternoon. I'd like to begin with this cartoon by the great Martin Turner in the Irish Times of March 15th, 2012. A somewhat gloomy self-portrait, battling the forces of darkness and repeating the mantra, "The pen is mightier than the sword," in an effort to convince himself and us that this is a tenable proposition. In the article accompanying the cartoon, Turner wrote that most cartoonists actually enjoy the thought that they might be upsetting the odd person through their drawings. He says, "We still see it as our mission to twist a few tails." That's T-A-I-L-S, not T-A-L-E-S. My purpose this afternoon is to show how, in an Irish context, a few tails got twisted in cartoons over the past 240 years. The earliest cartoon I want to speak about, this one, does in fact date back 240 years. One of the very first satirical cartoons in Ireland, it appeared in Matthew Carey's Volunteers' Journal on April 5th, 1784. Entitled, "Thus Perish All Traitors to Their Country," the victim is John Foster, then the Irish Chancellor of the Exchequer, and later the last Speaker of the Irish Parliament in College Green, Dublin, which is seen in the background. Foster is variously described elsewhere in the journal as Jackie Finance and Jack the Bloodsucker. Carey was arraigned for contempt before the Irish House of Commons on account of this cartoon and was jailed in Newgate Prison in Dublin. On his release, he fled to America and had a highly successful career as a publisher in Philadelphia. A plaque marks the location of his print shop in Philadelphia's Market Street. During the first half of the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell, seen here in silhouette, was the focus of innumerable cartoons produced in Dublin and in London, most of them hostile and savagely anti-Catholic. It has been difficult to know which ones to pick for this lecture. The most notable caricaturist of this period was a Catholic Irishman, John Doyle, who, however, plied his trade exclusively in London. As Peter Gray has pointed out, Doyle was, and I quote, preoccupied with Daniel O'Connell, whose career appeared to Doyle to embody a demagogic combination of radicalism, nationalism, and Catholic grievance politics. This is one of Doyle's best cartoons about O'Connell, published March 11th, 1883, showing him as Gulliver, brandishing a scroll bearing the word repeal, referring to his demand for repeal of the Act of Union of 1800, and being restrained and attacked ineffectively by his political opponents, who are dismissed as Lilliputians. In Swift's Gulliver's Travels, one of the Lilliputians shouts out the phrase "Tolgo ephonic," whatever that means in the Lilliputian language, after which all the Lilliputians start firing arrows at Gulliver. In this cartoon, the phrase is attributed to Earl Grey, the British Prime Minister, and the arrows are directed towards the repeal scroll held by O'Connell. The other clearly identifiable Lilliputians include the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Edward Stanley, later the Earl of Derby, and the Lord Lieutenant, the Marquis of Anglesey. My own favourite O'Connell cartoon is not by Doyle, but by John Leach, published in Punch in 1845. The title of it is The O'Connell Rent, referring to the subscriptions raised from the public for O'Connell's Repeal Association. The main image shows abject and deferential peasants paying the so-called rent to the great man. It's a pretty crude caricature, unlike the wonderfully whimsical drawings of incidents in O'Connell's life that appear in the borders. The upper border shows the military presence at Clontarf to prevent the monster meeting there, which O'Connell cancelled at the last moment in 1843. And this is juxtaposed against a police assault on gingerbread stands, presumably hawkers plying for business on the margins of the monster meeting. Thus is the abandoned monster meeting trivialized. The lower border focuses on the trial of O'Connell and others in 1844 for conspiracy against the state. O'Connell is in the dock. The presiding judges are opposite him. And in between, there is an incident involving dueling pistols, a not too subtle allusion to the duel in 1815 between O'Connell and John D'Stair, in which D'Stair was killed. At either end, Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister, and the Duke of Wellington, a leading member of Peel's government, keep an eye on what is going on. Similar items appear in the side borders, and I think these two are the best. King Dan being crowned at the monster meeting held at Tara, and an impish O'Connell in a carriage going to his trial. Of course, as Patrick Geoghegan has written, the result of the trial was rigged from the beginning. And here is a print of a lawyer, the artful dodger, with the devil, old Nick, in the state forge, and they are busy forging evidence of conspiracy for O'Connell's trial. It's a nice pun on the word forge. The Duke of Wellington looks on and proclaims, "This is a better place than Waterloo." This single sheet cartoon was actually published in Dublin. John Leach, the artist of the O'Connell Rent cartoon, and other Punch cartoonists, notably Henry Furness and John Tenniel, are notorious today for their Simeonization of the Irish. The late Professor Perry Curtis wrote about, and I quote, "the steady stream of derogatory or denigrating stereotypes emanating from London in the 19th century, mostly vividly expressed by the cartoonist's transformation of militant Irish nationalists, especially Fenian or Republican rebels, into ape-like or bestial creatures. Here are some examples of these cartoons, all by John Tenniel. The first dates from 1870, and Tenniel here uses the template of Shakespeare's play The Tempest to portray Irish agrarian radicals as the bestial Caliban, armed to the teeth. Gladstone is Prospero, and the staff, which is his instrument of magic, is his land reform bill, then passing through Parliament. And he is shielding his child, not Miranda, but Hibernia, from the frightening advances of Caliban. An unambiguous anti-Catholic sentiment is revealed by the inscription Ultramontane on Caliban's shoulder strap. Tenniel's identification of radical Irish nationalists with Caliban is even more explicit in this cartoon, referring to the testimonial of nearly £40,000, which was paid to Parnell by the Land League in 1883. Parnell is shown gratefully accepting the money from O'Caliban and acknowledging his debt to him, thereby, in Tenniel's eyes, compromising himself as a political leader. Undoubtedly, the worst of Tenniel's Irish cartoons is his Irish Frankenstein, which appeared in Punch shortly after the Phoenix Park murders in 1882. The killing of Lord Frederick Cavendish, Chief Secretary for Ireland, and his principal civil servant, Thomas Burke. A loathsome crime which shocked British public opinion and must have seemed to confirm these images of the Irish as monsters in the cartoons of Tenniel and his two most notable colleagues on Punch, John Leach and Henry Furness. Curiously, both Leach and Furness had strong Irish connections. Leach was of Irish extraction, and Furness was born in Wexford, albeit of English parents, and had begun his career with the Irish satirical magazine Zosimus. There were many satirical magazines in Dublin in the late 19th century, but none had as much impact or lasting significance as the cartoons published by the Weekly Freeman's Journal beginning in 1880. Introducing a satirical note into the mass circulation press in Ireland for the very first time, these cartoons were distributed gratis as supplements with the newspaper. They addressed political themes with great immediacy, and the fact that they were in colour added to their appeal. They were duly copied by other Irish newspapers, such as United Ireland and the Weekly Irish Times. These cartoons were a uniquely Irish phenomenon, with no exact equivalent in the British press. The three artists mainly responsible for them were John D. Ray, Thomas Fitzpatrick, and John Fergus O'Hee. O'Hee's cartoon, What Villains Have Done This, published by the Freeman in response to the Phoenix Park murders, is in stark contrast to Tenniel's Irish Frankenstein, and features the female figure of Erin. Perry Curtis observed that, although the iconic figure of Erin or Hibernia has a long history, the golden age of graphic images of this beautiful, young, and virtuous epitome of Ireland really belongs to the last third of the 19th century. Erin, the female figure, appears in about 1/3 of the cartoons published by the Weekly Freeman and United Ireland. The cartoons in the Weekly Freeman and United Ireland document the land war of the 1880s and are often reproduced in studies of that period. This one from the Weekly Freeman in July 1881 is, I think, special, since it refers to the Ladies' Land League, a neglected part of the story of the Land War. The Ladies' Land League was founded by Anna Parnell in January 1881, and some members were, like the men of the parent Land League, subject to prosecution. This cartoon is a scene from Kilmallock Petty Sessions, where the presiding resident magistrate was a Major Clifford Lloyd, hence the title of the cartoon, Justice Unalloyed. Gladstone's Land Act of 1881 was an attempt to address some of the concerns of the Land League. It gave power to civil bill courts to fix rents, termed judicial rents, with provision for referral to a land commission to appeal the judicial rents. This legislation was seen as creating endless possibilities for legal wrangling, a cash cow for lawyers. Accordingly, in January 1882, the satirical magazine Pat looked into the future with this vision of Ireland 100 years later, with the lawyers so rich that they have displaced the old landlords as proprietors of the land and are now sitting comfortably on their rents. The Atlantic Ocean has become the Atlantic, and St. George's Channel the Gorge on Us Channel, and Ireland is dire land. Many of you will have read Professor Margaret Kelleher's magnificent book about the Mamtrasna murders in 1882. We now know that there was a miscarriage of justice in this case, and that a man, Miles Joyce, was wrongly hanged and several others wrongly imprisoned for long terms. But their innocence was, in fact, widely accepted at the time, and there were accordingly many claims for a review of the case. Claims that were resisted by Dublin Castle under the Lord Lieutenant Lord Spencer, known as the Red Earl because of his enormous red beard. Spencer, ignoring the proofs of innocence of the condemned men, is the subject of this powerful cartoon in the Weekly Freeman. Two of the artists responsible for these wonderful cartoons, Thomas Fitzpatrick and John Fergus O'Hee, later collaborated on a monthly satirical magazine called The Leprechaun, published in Dublin between 1905 and 1915. By then, however, their style of cartooning had become dated. A more subtle and crisper kind of cartoon was appearing in London newspapers such as the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, a byproduct of the so-called Northcliffe Revolution, which created the modern populist press. This new form of cartooning came to Ireland with the recruitment of an Englishman, Ernest Forbes, to the staff of the Freeman's Journal in 1920. Using the pseudonym Seamus, he was the first regular cartoonist on an Irish daily newspaper. His cartoons during the War of Independence and Civil War were daring and hard-hitting. Up to the Truce of July 1921, their main target was the increasingly brutal nature of British rule in Ireland, while afterwards they attacked the new government of Northern Ireland and the Republican opposition to the Anglo-Irish Treaty signed in December 1921. I have written a short book about the Seamus cartoons, so again it is difficult for me to pick some to share with you today. This one, however, is my favorite. For quite apart from the force of its message, the punch that it packs, it is a most accomplished and skillful drawing. It's entitled No Uncertain Voice. It appeared in the Freeman on April 26, 1922, shortly after the occupation of the Four Courts in Dublin by armed anti-treatyites, the prelude to the outbreak of the Civil War. Its unambiguous message is that armed resistance to the treaty, symbolized by the skillfully drawn gunmen in the foreground, flouts majority opinion in Ireland. The building in the background is the Bank of Ireland in College Green, Dublin, the seat of the last Irish Parliament before the Act of Union of 1800. The caption as published has one of the gunmen asking, "What's all the noise?" To which the other replies, "Don't worry, it's only the voice of the unarmed people." And the unarmed people can be seen in the bottom left-hand corner, and their uncertain voice is being ignored by the gunmen. This Seamus cartoon was published on the occasion of the death of Michael Collins. It shows the female figure of Ireland, the iconic Erin, and she is prostrate with grief at Collins's death. The broken column is a traditional symbol for a life cut short, and each column in the cartoon bears the name of an Irish leader whose aims were not realized because of his untimely death. Collins is the latest in a line that includes Arthur Griffith, Charles Stewart Parnell, Daniel O'Connell, and others. Their broken columns mark out Ireland's Via Dolorosa, which is the title of the cartoon. It is probably the Seamus cartoon that most resonates with us today. I find that people always respond strongly to it, a tribute to the continuing cult of Michael Collins. Collins also features in this cartoon by David Lowe. He is dancing with Lloyd George in front of a gravestone that reads, "Here lies the Irish trouble, aged about 800 years." Entitled The Joy Jig Jazz, it was published in the London Evening Star newspaper on December 8, 1921, 2 days after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. It celebrates what Lowe assumed, or maybe just hoped, was the end of the centuries-long conflict between Britain and Ireland. But there are other important elements in it. It records Ulster Unionist satisfaction with the fact that the treaty confirms their exclusion from what would become the Irish Free State. At the top of the cartoon, there is a disembodied person, identified as possibly Sir James Craig, the Premier of Northern Ireland, or alternatively the editor of the Unionist Belfast newspaper, the Northern Whig. Whoever he is playing God Save Our Gracious King on a concertina. Is this the tune that Lloyd George and Michael Collins are dancing to? And if so, what is the significance of that? Is it a not too subtle allusion to the acceptance of the crown by Collins and his colleagues as part of the new constitutional framework for Ireland under the treaty? But not everyone is happy. In the bottom left-hand corner of the cartoon, we see two disgusted diehards, Southern Irish Protestants, and we are told that their occupation is gone. And this presumably refers to their occupation of the south of Ireland rather than to their jobs or professions. And they are said to be about to flee the country. Finally, Lowe inserts a self-portrait into this cartoon at the bottom right-hand side. And he is shown as very busy today, burning all the excellent cartoons he would have published if they hadn't made peace. Lowe clearly anticipates that with the advent of peace, there will be no further opportunity for such cartoons in the British press. But as I discuss later, he wasn't quite right about that. In 1921, when this cartoon was published, David Lowe was aged 30, and having arrived in London from Australia 2 years earlier, he was embarking on a career that would establish his reputation as the greatest cartoonist of the interwar years in Britain. This cartoon presents a sympathetic view of the Irish, unusual in the British press, and quite unlike that of Leach or Tennille. Lowe, as a fellow colonial, did not demonize the Irish, not even Michael Collins, the acknowledged mastermind behind the IRA's campaign of terror during the War of Independence. And note that Lowe's discarded cartoons, those that he is burning, include ones entitled Black and Tan and Jackboot, thereby suggesting disapproval of British policy in Ireland in the period leading up to the treaty. During the civil war that followed the treaty, the Republican publicity effort in Ireland was strengthened by the services of two women cartoonists, Constance Markovich and Grace Gifford, widow of the 1916 leader Joseph Mary Plunkett. Their cartoons were important because the very few and rather amateur print outlets available to the Republicans didn't have the capacity to include photographs, and cartoons were a tolerable substitute. Gifford was particularly talented, an artist and cartoonist of considerable ability. There was always a delightful, whimsical quality to her work, even in her political cartoons, which were necessarily propagandistic. A good example of her work during the Civil War is this cartoon, which shows Michael Collins as a circus ringmaster, inducing a dog to perform some tricks. The dog is identified as Ireland a province, and it is carrying a Union Jack and balancing an oath of allegiance on its nose. At the ringside is a dissolute King George V, accompanied by representatives of a supposedly happy empire, rather crudely caricatured as primitive tribesmen. The subliminal message is that the Anglo-Irish Treaty implies an equivalence between such tribesmen, lesser mortals, and the Irish people. Isabella McNee is the only other Irish woman cartoonist that I know of. A selection of her caricatures of members of the first government of the Irish Free State was published in 1925 as The Celebrity Zoo, under her pen name Mac. This is her portrait of Patrick McGilligan, Minister for Industry and Commerce, who was responsible for the Shannon hydroelectric scheme. And the portrait is accompanied by a verse which includes the following: "This fish, with guile to make you shiver, wants to harness the Shannon River." She was most unkind to Hugh Kennedy, Attorney General from 1922 to 24, and later the Free State's first Chief Justice. A heavy man, she drew him as a hippopotamus. The verse which goes with this caricature reads, "Look, for the graceful hippo comes in view. His feet are huge, but not so huge as Hugh, who as the foremost figure of the state finds he and his opinions carry weight." In March 1922, as Ireland drifted towards civil war, two young men, Arthur Booth and Charles E. Kelly, both Dubliners and both gifted cartoonists, launched Dublin Opinion, Ireland's most celebrated satirical magazine, a monthly miscellany of cartoons and other humorous figures. They were later joined by Tom Collins, another Dubliner, as the principal writer. The journal was modelled on a similar British magazine, London Opinion, published between 1903 and 1954. The first issue of Dublin Opinion sold out, and that was the start of a successful run that went on until 1968. Its light tone, at a time of great political upheaval in Ireland, seemed to catch the public imagination. It claimed not to have any politics, but instead to be on the side of the people and generally against whatever government was in power. Its policy was to give only kindly criticism, which meant that, as Kelly wrote, we made no enemies and our victims became our friends. It did not, however, always exercise such restraint, as when in March 1925 it published a cover cartoon of Eamon de Valera as leader of the Republican faction recently defeated in the Civil War. He is standing so tall that his head pushes the top border of the cartoon upwards and distorts the legend above it, with the caption, "High Treason." Kelly and Collins became joint editors of Dublin Opinion in 1926, after the premature death of Arthur Booth, the first editor. Both were employed as civil servants in Dublin and edited the magazine in their spare time. The character of Dublin Opinion was defined by the culture of the civil service. Quoting Robert Blake on the novels of Trollope, in Dublin Opinion, one constantly detects just below the surface that contempt, or if this is too strong a word, that bewilderment which civil servants so often feel at the conduct of their ostensible masters. Dublin Opinion was, however, also a perceptive critic of the civil service. For example, Kelly drew a series of whimsical cartoons depicting individual departments and offices, imputing to each a host of imagined absurdities. For example, this cartoon about the Department of Finance spread over 2 pages. Here are 2 details from the cartoon. The first shows an official confiscating, for the common good of course, some children's savings, while the second features the drain for putting the people's money down. Another series illustrated certain stock phrases that civil servants use in correspondence. A cartoon in this series, entitled "The Department Regrets," shows an office full of middle-aged men weeping copiously. Probably Dublin Opinion's finest hour was in 1959, when it stoutly defended the proportional representation voting system, PR, which De Valera and his Fianna Fáil government sought to abolish shamelessly for electoral advantage. 2 of its cartoons at that time were brilliantly incisive. The first, capitalizing on De Valera's reputation as a mathematics genius, has him standing at Broom Bridge in Dublin, associated with Rowan Hamilton's discovery of the formula for quaternion multiplication, and chalking up on the side of the bridge the formula FF, Fianna Fáil, minus PR equals FF to the power of n. The second shows a schoolroom with 3 boys of different heights at a blackboard on which their teacher has drawn 3 apples. And the teacher explains, under PR, each boy gets an apple. Under the straight vote, the proposed replacement, under the straight vote, the biggest boy gets the lot. The referendum necessary to abolish PR was lost by a narrow margin, and Dublin Opinion's campaign was widely credited with having had a critical influence on the outcome. It was, of course, unusual for serving civil servants to be so openly associated with a publication like Dublin Opinion, and this sometimes did give rise to controversy. The editor's dual roles were tolerated, most probably because Irish politicians were as amused as everyone else by the fare on offer, and they recognised its value in reducing the tensions in Irish public life after the Civil War. Sean T. O'Kelly, Ireland's second president, once praised it for pouring the balm of laughter on our wounds. And his words are significant, for despite the largely anti-establishment tone of satirical cartoons, their effect may be less to undermine the establishment than, ironically, to prop it up by channeling discontent into laughter and making the powerful seem less of a threat by ridiculing them. One of the classic interpretations of humour and laughter is relief theory, often associated with Sigmund Freud. And this posits that laughter serves to release tensions. It is, in the words of Mary Beard, the emotional equivalent of a safety valve. In the same vein, the editors of Dublin Opinion claimed that humour is the safety valve of a nation. And a nation which has its values right will always be able to laugh at itself, unquote. Satire, by this reckoning, is rarely more than political therapy, through which outrage turns into a joke and criticism of the establishment is thereby neutralised. Dublin Opinion virtually monopolised cartooning in Ireland during its years of publication. When the Freeman's Journal went out of business in 1924, Ernest Forbes returned to England. And except for the work of Gordon Brewster in the Evening Herald and the Sunday Independent, and of Victor Brown in the early years of the Irish press, the satirical cartoon was thereafter largely absent from Irish newspapers until the 1970s. Brewster's cartoons mostly eschewed Irish politics, focusing instead on lifestyle and socio-economic matters. Brown, like Forbes, was English, and his cartoons, under the signature B, were largely political. Since the press was the party organ of Fianna Fáil, they were blatantly partisan. His most provocative cartoon was his very first one, published in the inaugural issue of the Irish Press on September 5th, 1931. It shows a line of men and a woman in chains en route to the guillotine, and the first two have been dubbed Old Order and Social Pretension, respectively. Their fate, as foreshadowed here, is absurd fantasy, and therein lies the humour, the dark humour of the cartoon. Beneath the fun, however, there is a serious message. The remnants of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy and the so-called Castle Catholics and all others who do not subscribe to Fianna Fáil's version of Irishness will find themselves in trouble when Fianna Fáil and De Valera come to power. That there will be no place for them in De Valera's Ireland is signalled by the caption on the cartoon, which, slightly misquoting the Lord High Executioner's song in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, reads, "We've got them on the list, and they'll none of them be missed." Meanwhile, as anticipated by David Lowe in his cartoon marking the Anglo-Irish Treaty, British cartoonists after 1921 largely ignored Ireland and the Irish, but only until the Troubles in Northern Ireland broke out in the late 1960s and the IRA extended its campaign of violence to London and other parts of Britain. Some British cartoonists, especially in the tabloid press, responded to the Troubles by resurrecting and repackaging the image of the simian Irish from the pages of Punch a century earlier. Unlike in the Victorian era, such anti-Irish stereotypes now embraced the Protestant as well as the Catholic Irish. Thus, Raymond Jackson, Jack, published a cartoon in the Evening Standard in 1992 depicting a spoof film poster for the ultimate in psychopathic horror, the Irish, with terrorists on both sides of the Troubles depicted as equally misshapen monsters, comparable to those in the Punch cartoons. Occasionally, however, British cartoons displayed a more sophisticated perspective on the Troubles. One such is Nicola Jennings' Harp and Guns, in which the strings of the symbolic Irish harp are replaced by guns, and the shadow of a gunman heaves into view, a genuflection towards Sean O'Casey's play of that name. Instead of the usual figure of a winged maiden on the harp, there is a dove, acknowledgement of an aspiration to peace despite the violence endemic in Ireland. Brexit gave rise to further negative anti-Irish stereotype in British cartoons. The most controversial instance of this was Christian Adams' cartoon in the London Evening Standard of July 2019, which showed the last surviving candidates, then contesting for the leadership of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, as leprechauns, chasing a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. The elusive pot of gold bears the inscription, "No backstop." It thus ridicules the unrealistic expectation, peddled by both candidates, that the special arrangements proposed for Northern Ireland, the Irish backstop, would not be required in the withdrawal agreement they would negotiate with the European Union. A leprechaun trope in a cartoon about an issue pertaining to Ireland, even if British politicians are the target, was undoubtedly insensitive and was generally regarded as such. In Northern Ireland during the Troubles, when mayhem, violence, and death were everyday facts of life, more was at stake in addressing issues in a cartoon than elsewhere. The imperative, at least for the mainstream press here, was to avoid heightening sectarian tensions. Ian Knox's cartoon for the Irish News, the main nationalist newspaper in Northern Ireland, about the car bomb attack by an IRA splinter group in Omagh, which killed 29 people and injured over 200 in August 1998, is a good example of how a cartoonist can convey outrage at an atrocity with tact and good taste. It shows the coffins of those who died that day being carried off in one direction, while another coffin, marked violent republicanism, is brought in the opposite direction, towards the metaphorical grave that Republicans have dug for themselves by their actions. On the question of whether cartoons on such sensitive topics are appropriate, Knox has said, "I never shrank from any issue. If you've got it right, even if it's horrible, the victims don't object." Another example of a cartoon in response to an atrocity in Northern Ireland that got it right is this one, by a very talented young Dublin-based cartoonist, Harry Burton. It refers to the shooting dead of the journalist Lyra McKee by Republicans during a riot in Derry in April 2019. The words quoted in the cartoon are taken from an open letter to herself that McKee wrote and published in 2014 when she was aged just 24. Words about her hopes for the future that she was so tragically denied by continuing Republican violence. After Dublin Opinion ceased publication in 1968, there was sadly no successor magazine in Ireland. But the vacuum was filled when Martin Turner was employed by the Irish Times as its first full-time cartoonist in 1976. In the words of Professor Terence Brown, his politically acute cartoons add to that newspaper's reputation for sharply expressed and hard-hitting commentary. This is particularly true of his contributions on what might be called the liberal agenda. A fine example of his work in this vein is a cartoon published after the defeat of a proposal to lift a constitutional ban on divorce in the Republic in 1986. Those who had resisted the change are compared to the obdurate Orange Order in Northern Ireland, with their propensity to say no to every reform. The banner incorporates a portrait of De Valera clutching his constitution in place of King Billy, and the exhortation is to remember 1937, the year of the adoption of Dev's constitution, instead of 1690, the year of the Battle of the Boyne. Without hesitation, I can say that Turner's greatest cartoon to date is that published on the front page of the Irish Times, itself an unusual occurrence, on February 17th, 1992, about the Irish government's efforts to prevent a pregnant 14-year-old girl from traveling to England for an abortion. As you know, until 1918, there was a constitutional ban on abortion. The cartoon linked the young girl's predicament with internment without trial in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. The depiction of the girl, with her hair in a pigtail and carrying a teddy bear, standing on a map of Ireland, surrounded by a razor wire topped fence, left an indelible mark on the public discourse in Ireland on the abortion issue. Sometimes satire does matter. It can do much more than make us laugh. And this is an example of that. More recently, in 2012, in response to the collapse of confidence in so many pillars of Irish society, Turner offered this little gem. Each of the four figures here, politician, priest, banker, and doctor, asks us to trust me, despite the fact that each one represents a discredited part of the Irish establishment. But note the little guy in the bottom right-hand corner. He is a regular feature in Turner's cartoons, a sort of Greek chorus. And in this instance, he tells us, a few more tribunals would sort the country out. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. But perhaps what we really need now to sort out our country is a few more cartoonists. I think that's a good note on which to conclude. Thank you.
Felix, thank you so much for that extraordinarily wide-ranging review of the history of cartooning in and about Ireland. Tour de force. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We always have an audience in the room. We have an audience joining us online through Teams. So to ask a question, if you're online, raise your hand electronically or type a question into the text box. Rebecca will let us know. Anyone in the room, just raise your hand normally. We'll open it to the floor for questions. Anyone like to start? Yes, Marie.
Before Robert Turner was employed full-time by the Irish Times, I right in thinking that Nicholas Robinson did some cartooning.
Yes.
Are you saying anything about, was his political, I don't know a huge amount, but I was just thinking.
I don't know a huge amount about him either. I do know one very strong cartoon that he wrote or that he drew at the time of Wood Key. Portrayed FX Martin on a currency note, and of course he and Mary Robinson, or Mary Burkett, she probably was then, were very much involved in the Wood Key in the Wood Key episode. My view is, or my understanding is that you know he was the son of a Dublin solicitor. there was a firm, his father's firm, there waiting for him whenever he wanted to become active as a solicitor, and that his period as a cartoonist, which I think was no more than about 3 or 4 or 5 years, his period as a cartoonist really was a way of avoiding that fate. I've read, I think in Mary Robinson's autobiography, that one of the reasons that her family objected to her marrying him was that he was a mere cartoonist. But no, I don't think his work was particularly insightful. It certainly hasn't come on my radar. But he himself is a very significant scholar of cartoons, particularly 18th century cartoons. And in fact, just in the past year, he has published a beautiful collection with Four Courts Press of his own cartoons. And it's a really lovely coffee table book. But there's an earlier book about cartoons on Edmund Burke, which he much more scholarly book than the later one. Yeah.
Hello. Yes, two parts to the question. First of all, Felix, thank you. It was very, very fascinating talk. The first one was in relation to Ernest Howlin and his work with Jim Larkin's the Irish Worker and so on. Do you cover that? You obviously did work with his sister Niamh in relation to things like sheets and revolt and so on, and prevent recruitment and other cartoons you did regularly with the Irish Worker.
Yep.
And then the second part of the question, Trace, which I thought was fantastic, is the thread that runs through both Punch and then up to today, the simian idea, and your thoughts on whether that still persists as a very active British press.
Taking the first one first, yes, I am aware of the Ernest Kavanagh work, and indeed of James Curry's book, which is excellent on the subject. Peter mentioned at the beginning that I have an essay coming out later in the year on Irish legal cartoons, and the Asinine. What's the title of it? The Asinine. The Asinine Law. I can't remember my own word. The Asinine Law actually pinches the title of an Ernest Kavanagh cartoon, where he has a judge. He has a donkey dressed as a judge, and that is the first cartoon that I have and published in that kind of legal history volume, or will publish. So I am well aware of. The sad thing, I suppose, is that he only worked for about 3 or 4 years. So and of course it's very hard to choose what to include in a limited paper. Even at, I was just checking my watch. I've been speaking for 50 minutes. I'm sure I was only supposed to speak for 40, but. So obviously you leave a lot of with things out. I'm very conscious of having left out stuff from Zosimus. For example, my late friend Chris Williams in Cork had begun to do a lot of work on with Zosimus, and in fact I have an unpublished paper and by him in which he looks at those cartoons. But again, Zosimus was only there for under 2 years. So there's a lot of work to be done. Sadly, Chris died of a heart attack at age 60 last April. He and I had spoken about doing a collection of essays on cartoonists, and we would have done it indeed, but well, that's not going to happen now with him, at least. But there's an enormous amount of work to be done. On the Simianization, it does pop up every now and again. You saw it in the Brexit thing. I was reviewing some before going to bed yesterday evening, actually, and I came across one from the London Times, which I should have included. a Peter Brooks one, and I think Peter Brooks is just a superb cartoonist. But at the time of Biden's visit to Ireland, he has a series of images on a Biden dressed as a cartoon, dressed as a leprechaun, doing dancing a jig with a glass of Guinness in his hand. So as recently as Biden's visit to Ireland, a respectable British cartoonist was, poking that sort of not quite Simeonization, but nonetheless denigratory.
Yeah, right. Putting aside the question of any legal process against these cartoonists, are there any or many examples of actual violence or incitement against them or their publisher?
Not that I'm aware of. Turner has had a couple of cartoons pulled. He has from time to time he has published volumes of his cartoons, which are well worth acquiring if you're interested in these things. But he talks about a cartoon that he drew on the occasion of Haughey's resignation as Taoiseach in 1992, where he lists, he kind of has this image of Haughey, and he said, kind of 40, what do I have to show for 40 years in Irish public life? And at the side, private island, Gandon House in North County Dublin, yacht, blah, 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 blah. And the Irish Times wouldn't unpublish that and claimed that it was libelous. It probably was unkind on the occasion. But on the other hand, he had resigned in disgrace. There was another occasion where at the time of the Bishop Casey episode, and again he had let me see if I get the punchline correct. He had the image of he had portrayed Casey, and I have sinned, I have fathered. The idea of bless you, Father, for I have sinned. And again, that's it. That's it exactly. Thank you, Marie. Again, they didn't publish that. It wasn't obviously libelous because it was true, but it was, I suppose, in bad taste. Again, one of the things that are very striking in cartoons is that cartoons, in good taste, cartoons punch upwards. They don't punch downwards. So things like say Charlie Hebdo, they give offense because they are seen to be punching downwards. The Simeonization of the Irish give offense because it's perceived as punching downwards. Good taste, at least, and I'd put it no stronger than that, implies that it is it's a weapon of the dispossessed rather than the other way around.
Yes, thanks so much for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I was just curious if you could reflect a little bit on the authorship of these cartoons. Personally, I'm working on Internet Satire, which also sort of references the
Very
past.
interesting, yeah.
And there it's not always necessarily easy to identify the author. There's not necessarily even an author behind those satires. They're just their visual humor about the past, basically. And I think that does something. And I was just curious.
That's a great question. No, it's a great question.
And also, especially connected to your talk about punching up.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. When I was working on the Seamus Cartoons book, I had access to the original drawings of the cartoons, which, in fact, I purchased for the National Library on behalf of the National Library. They turned up in an auction house in Dublin. They didn't know what they had. I was probably the only man alive who knew what they were, and there were 300 drawings of his cartoon, all of which are now digitized on the National Library website, by the way, but not well digitized, and I'll tell you why. I got first use of them for my book in 2009. He drew the cartoons on something approximating A3 sheets, but he would occupy about 2/3 of it, and there would be instructions on the side to the printers or other comments. Now, they have not been digitized. The only thing they've digitized are the actual images. And on several of the cartoons, part of the marginalia is check with such and such a person. I can think of one in particular where he puts a note to the printer, check with Mr. Donovan that this is what he wanted. Mr. Donovan wrote the editorials in the Freeman's Journal. So he was undoubtedly at that stage, he was working to order. The work that I've done on David Lowe, and David Lowe ended up working for Beaverbrook in the Express. The cartoon I showed was a very early one. He ended up working for the Daily Express during most of the 1930s. The Express was a pro-appeasement paper. He was virulently anti-Nazi, and he was given a free hand. But in what I've read about him, the remark is often made that he was the only cartoonist in Britain at the time who was able to work against the editorial thrust of his own paper. So I think, undoubtedly, like I actually know Martin Turner. I've absolutely no doubt that Turner does his own stuff. No doubt about that whatsoever. When does this editorial freedom come in? I can't tell you that, except to say that, obviously, given that the odd cartoon by Turner is withheld or spiked by the Irish Times, there is still an editorial input into it. And of course, as has been widely recognized, the Washington Post spiked a cartoon by Anne Telnaes in January, an anti-Trump, not only an anti-Trump cartoon, but a cartoon where she mocks the tech giants so toadying to Trump, including Bezos, who is the owner of the Washington Post. The Washington Post refused to publish it, and she resigned. I think the current ethos would be to have a lot of respect for the autonomy of the individual cartoonist in exactly the same way as somebody writing a column for the paper has a certain amount of autonomy, but there's a limit. But that is pretty recent, and certainly didn't apply to Ernest Forbes in the Freeman's Journal. He drew to order, as far as I can see, and his cartoons are entirely in harmony with the editorial policy of the paper.
Yes, that was a really excellent talk. I was wondering, maybe it's a bit of the scope of your research, but is there a Northern Irish element to this cartoon? So, say, before, during, after partition, is there much evidence of, say, nationalists in Ulster who are feeling the sting of the regime using cartoons as a sort of act of protest?
I haven't come across them. I'd freely admit that I haven't done much work on Northern Ireland newspapers, and in fact, may I say, here in Queens, if somebody wants a PhD or master's with thesis, there are several very interesting papers that could be looked at. The only Northern cartoonist that I've done any work on is Knox, who I mentioned, and he's with the Irish News, so he's he's working from a moderate nationalist viewpoint. That's all I can say. I just don't know. There's work.
Roald Friars would be the other well-known cartoonist.
He would be, but he did a lot of work for Dublin journals, and I don't think his audience was specifically Northern. Generally, I may be wrong about that, but I wonder what he. But was he very political?
Yes,
he was. I see. Okay.
Tom Kinnon's book is probably the best.
Yes, I agree. Yes, no, I agree. Yeah. But again, I'm not sure that there are many Northern cartoons in it. John's book is cartoons on the theme of Northern Ireland, and I yes, yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Yeah.
Have there been, or are there any female cartoonists? And if so, do they take a different slant?
Okay, that's a great question again, because overwhelmingly the political cartoonists are men. And I've thought about this quite a lot, and I think until very recently, and perhaps even still, politics is seen as a man's game, and the journalists who cover it are men, and therefore the cartoonists are men. I did mention Constance Markovich and Grace Gifford. Gifford ceases to do political cartoons after the end of the Civil War. Her later work is overwhelmingly theatrical. She did, work for the Abbey Theatre, and she has two books, two actual collections of representations of Abbey plays, iconic Irish Abbey Theatre plays. And Isa McNee, whom I mentioned, the Paddy McGilligan and Hugh Kennedy cartoons, her book, as far as I'm aware, that they are the only political portraits that she did. Probably her most famous cartoon is the famous one of W.B. Yeats and A.E. Crossing one another passing on one another in Merrion Square, and W.B. Yeats with his head in the air, and A.E. with his head in his feet, and they walk past one another without recognizing one another. I'm not sure where she published, to be honest with you. She came on my radar because of her book, which is where I took those two images from. Her book, by the way, is very hard to track down, and I actually was very lucky to be given access to a copy by a private individual who actually owns a copy, who inherited a copy from her father. So I'm not sure even that the National Library have it. So then in Britain, Nicola Jennings, whose cartoon, The Guns, Harp and Guns, I think she's a fabulous cartoonist. But in fact, that Harp and Guns cartoon is probably my favorite cartoon, which is why I offered it to Peter for the flyer. And I've used it before with flyers for variations on this paper. There are a number of female cartoonists who turn up in Private Eye from time to time, but they tend not to be political. They tend to be more social and societal rather than political.
Any questions online?
Yes, just one. Benjamin David Casey says, "Thank you for this fascinating lecture. I have a question about legal caricatures. Why do you think Irish caricaturists keep returning to lawyers as subject matter over the 2 centuries of legal sound?"
Well, well, can I recommend my forthcoming essay to elucidate that? I suppose the attitude, the approach is that, you know, lawyers are pompous people. They are part of the establishment, and sometimes the law has absurd outcomes. You know, hence the Charles Dickens line about the law is an ass, which of course picks up the Asinine Law idea that is in the Ernest Kavanagh cartoon. So, you know, on the basis that cartoons are anti-establishment, and you know they're on a kicking up against establishment figures, lawyers are a very, very rich target for cartoonists. And in my forthcoming essay, hopefully published June or July of this year, I have no less than 52 images in the essay, including the last one in this lecture, where you have the four figures saying "trust me" and the lawyer coming up and saying "trust me." So yeah, I think that's why our lawyers are a good target.
Thank you very much. That was really enjoyable. My question is whether you know examples where cartoons are actually ambiguous or perhaps misinterpreted. Like, I would be interested in satire. Satire I look at would be textual satire. They don't always communicate. They sometimes misfire. So I'm just wondering, in comparison with like textual satire, where basically irony, somebody might read it, you know, literally. So just wondering in terms of visual.
Yeah, there's one recent instance of that which actually cost the man his job, and this was Steve Bell in The Guardian. And there is a magnificent, it's a classic cartoon of LBJ during the Vietnam War. And Johnson had he had an operation while he was president. Let's think about 1965. And his first press, he was such a vulgar character that at his first press conference after he returned to work, he opened his shirt to show the press his scar. And David Levine, who was a brilliant American cartoonist, he did a portrait of Johnson with his shirt open and a scar in the shape of the map of Vietnam. The classic. Last year, well, maybe it was 2023. Steve Bell, who is a really tough cartoonist now, he doesn't pull his punches. He did a cartoon of Netanyahu with his shirt open and a scar in the shape of Gaza. And he was clearly picking up the David Levine precedent. But some people insisted on seeing it as the Merchant of Venice and Shylock taking the pound of flesh. And he was criticized for being anti-Semitic. And the Guardian, the liberal Guardian of all papers, sacked him in deference to that. And it was a classic example of a misreading of his cartoon, and a very disgraceful misreading in my view.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much. Just to endorse the comment about the richness of Northern cartoonists, especially during the Troubles, as a subject of study, especially Ian Knox. I had a comment about Ian Knox. Nuala O'Connor used him as got commissioned cartoons from him to illustrate her book about the peace process, Breaking the Bonds. But she did say that that she thought he might not always have managed an even balance between his characterization of Unionists and Nationalists and Loyalists and Republicans. And it's an interesting take, perhaps, on the Simeonization, that very often he would represent Unionists and Loyalists, Orangemen, as dinosaurs. So it's a dinosaurization rather than
yeah, well, I suppose you could accuse Martin Turner having done the same thing in that cartoon on the divorce issue, where he's you know, clearly comparing the anti-divorce people to the obdurate Orange Order, as you know, to use the phrase that I used. No, I think it's too much to expect a cartoonist to be even-handed. A cartoonist is twisting a few tails. You know, he's going out to give offence to people. There's a great we were talking about Steve Bell, but there's a great Steve Bell comment about, you know, how much easier it is to get a message across in an image than in a normal piece of journalism, where you perhaps are expected to be a bit more nuanced, but you can really pack a punch in a cartoon. But I must look out for that book, because we will thank you for that. I'm not aware of it. There was, by the way, a fantastic exhibition in the Lindenhall Library here on cartoons, which I actually reviewed. I reviewed for a blog called Writing the Troubles, which actually Sophie Cooper was one of the people involved. Yes, it was. And I forget how long ago that is, but it's certainly pre-COVID. But it was a fantastic exhibition, yeah. Sorry, can't hear you.
Sorry, I was really struck by that image that you had of the X case and the girl with the fence. That's a really powerful image. I'm just wondering, and it links to the question asked about women cartoonists. So if you don't have many women cartoonists in terms of like issues like abortion, contraception, or the introduction of equal pay or sex discrimination legislation, have you come across many cartoonists on that? And have you done so?
I think the answer to that is probably no. Sorry.
Women's rights and the...
Oh yeah, well, there's a wonderful one. Yes, you're absolutely right. There was a cover during the referendum campaign of the 1937 Constitution. There was a cover of De Valera. In fact, I have this in my legal cartoons essay. Another reason to buy the book. De Valera asleep in his bed, and he's dreaming about being attacked by Grania Whale and Queen Maeve. And the caption is, "Hey big boy," about those articles in the Constitution. So that is certainly an example. But that was there was a lot of unease in 1937 about that those articles. So it was picking up a very popular point of view. I think you're talking about something that's slightly sharper than that. Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you, if you come across any, let me know. But you're certainly the cartoon. Martin Turner's cartoons in the Irish Times are consistently fighting for a liberal point of view. I can't point to any on the particular. I'm sure there has to be one on contraception somewhere. You would think that. And by the way, just apropos, Northerners and cartoons. Don't forget, Turner's an Englishman who, like yourself, came to Queen's to do postgraduate work, joined the staff of Fortnight in the magazine. And was actually editor of Fortnight magazine at one stage before he came to Dublin as a cartoonist. So he has a northern connection.
Part of my research is looking at sort of representations of criminal conversation in like the late 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. And I was wondering, do you know of any Irish cartoonists that are sort of more social cartoonists from that period? Because of course I'm looking a lot at Gilroy and Cruikshank, but I'm just trying to find like a contemporary book from Ireland, and I was wondering if you knew.
You're talking about something that's very, very, very early. What tends to happen with Irish publications of that period is that because British copyright didn't apply in Ireland, Irish publishers tended to just simply reproduce cartoons that had been unpublished in Britain. The person to ask about this is James Kelly, who is Professor of History in DCU. And James, in fact, did a paper in Boston College, which you probably would get online, on what he called single sheet cartoons. He probably did it. Again, I have a reference to it in the legal cartoons essay. I haven't got it off the top of my head, but you'd have no difficulty on finding it, because the Boston College seminars are recorded and they're up on the website. But James is very approachable, and you know, he's the person to ask about that. You know, anything I've used, I've kind of canonized from his work. I'm very much a late 19th, early 20th century historian.
So we're running out of time, but I am going to ask you a final question.
Good.
And that is...
he's going to kill me.
Apologies to other people in the audience here, but this is the economics question. So in addition to being political commentary and possibly even arts, cartoons are also economic products. They require resources, time to produce and to publish. Running a satirical magazine is incredibly costly and needs a subscriber base.
Yeah.
Producing single print cartoons also needs a market. So, you know, how does that fit into your story? For long periods of time, for the first 2/3 of the 19th century, Ireland really struggles to produce or to have a market for consumption of political satire. This seems to change in the later decades of the 19th century. But even then, there are costs involved. You know, in the employment of regular cartoonists, decisions have to be made to commit resources on the part of editors to our editorial boards for this. So, I mean, well,
you're right.
Across, you know,
you're right. In the early magazines, such as Zosimus in the 19th century, they don't last very long. I think Zosimus only lasted 2 years. The first really serious run of cartoons is in the Weekly Freeman's Journal, and that was part of, you know, the beginnings of the new journalism. So they were on the weekly paper, not on the daily paper, which remained the kind of stodgy, you know, a 19th century paper you expect to see. But with the Freeman's Journal, they started to introduce features, and among those on the features were these cartoons. The Freeman's Journal at that stage was an extraordinarily successful paper with huge, it had no competition as a nationalist daily newspaper in Dublin at the time. And it only goes out of business when competition comes in a serious way. So they were innovative in a very real way, and you are right. Of course, it cost them a lot of money. Dublin, again, when Ernest Forbes comes over, that is part of the Northcliffe and the Revolution. When the Irish part, on the Freeman's Journal had been effectively owned by the Irish Parliamentary Party. That company goes into liquidation in 1919 after the party disappears in the 1918 general election. It's bought over by a company controlled by two men, one Martin Fitzgerald, who was a Dublin businessman, and a man called Hamilton Edwards. And Hamilton Edwards was a former Northcliffe journalist who had retired to Ireland. He was an interest in horse racing, and he retired to Ireland and set up a stud. and Fitzgerald was interested in horse racing as well. And the pair of them entered a partnership and bought the Freeman's Journal. And Northcliffe, you know, those modern sharper cartoons was part of the Northcliffe Revolution. Hamilton Edwards brought his man from London, Ernest Forbes, into the Freeman's Journal and used the cartoons very astutely. Like even when Brewster was being published by the Independent in the 30s and the 40s, he was being published on the back page of the Evening Herald in a very small box. If we didn't, again, we have some of his original drawings. If we didn't have the original drawings, the quality of the reproduction within the Evening Herald would not allow us to reproduce them. But in the case of the Freeman's Journal, they used the cartoons and advertised them as a feature. Of course, even that company went out of business. Dublin Opinion had a circulation of 40,000 copies for most of its life. I don't know about the economics of that. It was a monthly magazine, so there were only 12 issues a year. It's quite easy to research it. I have leafed through the full file. I have a campaign with the National Library to get them to digitize it, because it would be wonderful to have those images to complement the work that other people are doing in the period. But they kept it going. The two people who started it were Collins and Kelly. They were still doing it in 1968 when they sold up, and they sold up merely because, well, they certainly sold up because they were old, but they also sold up because by the 1960s, you know, you had That Was the Week That Was on BBC television being broadcast into Ireland, and you had Private Eye, and that was a much tougher form of cartooning, and the Dublin Opinion looked very tame by comparison, so they were probably losing circulation by that stage. But you know, it's very, very hard to get any information about the internal workings of a newspaper, never mind the detailed economics of it. Even for something like the Freeman's Journal in its heyday, all you have, you know, it becomes a public company in 1887, and you have you have annual reports after that. But you know, the breakdown of costs within an annual report at that stage was not very detailed. Doesn't quite answer your question, except to say that they survived. and you know, they tended to, you know, certainly the papers would and the Freeman's Journal in particular with the Seamus cartoons, they actually advertised it as a feature of the paper, a selling point, exactly.
Felix, thank you so much. It's been a great lecture.
Thank you.
I'm just going to remind people that if you do want to follow up on Felix's next publication, Confluences of Law and History, the collection will be out in the summer of this year.
Well, I've just signed off on the final page proofs, so it's up to Four Courts Press now how long it'll take. But Martin Fanning tells me June, July.
Okay, thank you very much, Felix. Just a reminder, no lecture or no seminar next week. Patrick's Day. 2 weeks' time, we have Frank Rinn from Paris University coming to talk about namesake Frank Byrne, who is an invincible, one of the people involved in the Felix Park murders, who escapes to Paris. And Frank Rinn has been following his trajectory through the French courts and through the French press in 1883. So come and join us for that in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.